Shockwaves of grief roll through Cordova, Tennessee, when high school coach and preacher Jimmy McClain is assassinated in his living room.
It was really tough because you knew Jimmy wouldn't hurt a fly.
Could he have had any enemies? Could he have been involved in any vices or anything?
The answers to these questions surprise investigators as they uncover an expansive roster of suspects.
I drove behind him and put that briefcase on the love seat.
How did she know this much about the crime scene?
But which of the suspects had a strong enough motive to want the much-loved former basketball star dead?
This is pure hate. Who hated him this much to do this?
25 miles east of downtown Memphis is Cordova, Tennessee, a once tiny farming town that has grown into an upscale suburban sanctuary.
Cordova is what I would describe as a bedroom community. It's off the beaten path, away from, the madness, if you will.
A lot of influential people living there, a lot of nice homes, well kept.
Despite the influx of well-heeled urbanites from the city, Cordova still holds on to that small-town feeling. It's what attracts 34-year-old Jimmy McClain. And in 1997, the former professional basketball player makes the town his home.
Jimmy was attracted to Cordova because of the family environment. It was a place where he felt that he could raise his children.
He buys a house in a gated community, and 4 years later marries Megan Danvers, who moves in with her 2 children, 10-year-old Dwayne and 14-year-old Rachel.
Give me some.
There you go. Life keeps getting better for Jimmy when he takes a job as a finance teacher at Ridgeway High School on the outskirts of Memphis.
You ready for school today, young man?
Yes, sir.
Nice.
Jimmy really wanted to impact young people's lives. That was a passion of his. That's, I think, what led him more than anything to go into teaching.
Over time, however, the passion he finds in teaching gradually fades from his marriage. After 11 years, his wife Megan and her kids move out, leaving Jimmy alone.
They had been going through a divorce that was an on-again, off-again type process for a matter of years.
Despite the separation, Jimmy keeps his life full. He meets a new woman, Hannah Morrison, and pursues his other prime passions: coaching the varsity basketball team and serving as a youth minister at his church.
There was 2 things with Jimmy: God and basketball.
He was real disciplined about his spiritual life. He was committed to preaching the word.
He's also the kind of person you can always rely on. So on the morning of Friday, February 22nd, 2013, when the now 49-year-old fails to show up for work for a second straight day, his colleagues begin to worry.
A couple other coaches tried to reach out to him by calling him and knew something wasn't right.
That was not like Jimmy at all. He was very responsible. He was not a person who would just not show up to work.
Concerned administrators call the Shelby County Sheriff's Office, and Lieutenant Kevin Helms sends a patrol to do a welfare check. 20 minutes later, deputies arrive at Jimmy's house. When they knock at the front door, no one answers.
Mr. McClain, are you home?
They did a circle around the house. The garage door was down. The doors were all locked. There was nothing that stood out right off the bat.
Through a window in the garage, investigators see 2 cars parked inside.
We made a call back to the school to verify what type of vehicle that Jimmy drove, and they described a white 4-door vehicle, which actually was in the garage. Everything looked normal.
It's not until they try to see inside the house that they believe something's wrong.
Is that a shell casing? All right, this doesn't look good. Stand back.
Police saw a bullet casing, and that's when they decided to force their way into the property.
What they discover inside is far worse than any of Jimmy's friends and colleagues could ever imagine.
As soon as they entered the back door, immediately to the right, there was a black male in the floor with a lot of blood around the head and torso area.
Call for an ambulance and get us some backup.
It's Jimmy McLean, dead cold to the touch, with multiple gunshot wounds to the back of his head and chest. Moments later, backup arrives, and as they take one look around the room, they can tell his murder isn't part of a random robbery.
There's still money in the wallet.
His wallet was laying next to him, and you could easily see money. Nothing was ransacked.
Also, a briefcase is lying on a chair nearby, and Jimmy's cell phone and car keys are in his pockets.
It did appear that whenever this occurred, that he had just arrived home, and this situation happened pretty soon after the fact.
You clear right, I'll clear left.
A brief search of the house reveals there's no one else in the residence. Something else is quickly apparent. There's no sign of a struggle, but it looks like Jimmy was caught in a hail of gunfire, as there's blood spatter on the walls.
Numerous shell casings, numerous bullet holes throughout the house, and bullets that lodged in the walls, some even upstairs having ricocheted off the fireplace.
This immediately told me that the subject or subjects were shooting from different areas.
And also what type of gun they used.
These shell casings were to a .40 caliber, and most consistent to a .40 caliber is with a handgun.
There's no weapon to be found, nor evidence of a break-in.
The windows were locked and the doors were locked. It was apparent that the person had a way of getting in. Either Jimmy letting him in the door or the killer coming in with his own key.
Not only that, but the killer must have also used a key to lock up behind them. Only two things appear out of place. A rolled-up towel that's been pushed into a corner by the front door, and some marks on the tile next to it.
We noticed some muddy footprints in the foyer area.
There's no mud on Jimmy's shoes or anywhere else in the house, which suggests the killer left the shoe print. To be sure, investigators go through Jimmy's closet to see if any of his other shoes have the same tread.
I'm not finding a match on any of these treads with the print downstairs.
That's all right. We'll keep looking. You never know what we're gonna find.
The footprint didn't match any of the shoes that Jimmy had and weren't the right size.
The muddy print reveals another clue.
And you could clearly see the toe was in the direction of somebody walking in.
It became apparent that the perpetrator had come in that front door where the footprints were.
And with only one print, investigators have reason to assume that the killer acted alone. As they take a cast of the print, investigators do a forensic sweep of the house to see if the killer left behind any other calling cards.
We dusted for fingerprints, especially doorknobs or any kind of entries. We didn't know if maybe the suspect had been injured in any way. And so we took a lot of blood samples from spatter throughout the area, around the body and on the walls.
Perhaps the most revealing clues to this brutal crime are found on Jimmy's body.
He's been dead at least 24 hours.
The medical examiner determines that Jimmy was shot 7 times from different distances, explaining the barrage of bullets. Some of the shots are at point-blank range.
He got hit and he went down, and we knew this subject stood on top of him and continued to shoot numerous times into him.
There was only one firearm that was used to kill Jimmy. One gun that had shot him and shot him and shot him and shot him.
No question, it's overkill. Which leads them to make another assumption.
The fact that the shooter stood over him and fired more and more indicated that this was probably a very personal thing.
This was an act of vengeance or anger. That kind of leads to the assumption that there's someone who is close to you.
But everyone who knew Jimmy loved him, or so they all had made it seem.
This is pure hate. Who hated him this much to do this?
On February 22nd, 2013, in the sleepy community of Cordova, Tennessee, local high school coach Jimmy McClain's murder has his grief-stricken friends and neighbors desperate for answers.
For a person like Jimmy to be gunned down in a nice house, a gated community, a place where this type of crime is not supposed to happen, is pretty exceptional.
Reports of the shooting spread on social media, reaching all of his immediate family. After rushing to the house, Jimmy's mother, brother, and sister wait anxiously outside, hoping for more information from the police.
When I saw the police tape around his house, I can say that it was the worst day of my life. I was just heartbroken.
It's like I lost part of my soul. Like my whole part, another part of my soul just went, the other half just went out.
Are you Jimmy's family?
Shelby County detectives want to speak to someone from Jimmy's family, and his sister, Easter, volunteers. They escort her into a neighbor's house, where police have set up a command center.
Easter, I need to know everything you can tell us about Jimmy.
Investigators begin asking Easter about her brother's life, wondering if anyone might have a personal grudge against Jimmy.
Any questionable activities he was involved with?
No. Jimmy was a community guy, well-liked.
Could he have had any enemies? Could he have been involved in any vices, or could this be something in Jimmy's background?
No. Jimmy was a good man through and through.
There's nothing there, and nothing but a positive picture of Jimmy.
I could not imagine why someone would hurt my brother. He's the least likely person that someone would want to hurt.
It was really tough because you knew Jimmy wouldn't hurt a fly.
Investigators have another shock for her.
There was no sign of forced entry. Do you think that Jimmy might have let his killer in?
That's impossible. Jimmy was very, very careful about security.
Anybody that knew Jimmy knew he would just not open his door and let a stranger in.
No.
So you knew then it had to be somebody that he knew that he let in, or somebody that had a key.
Did anyone else have keys to Jimmy's house?
Possibly his wife.
She thought that Megan might still have access to the house.
Jimmy had not changed the locks in the sense she had keys to the house.
Megan was still over Jimmy's a lot.
According to Easter, Megan is still getting mail at Jimmy's house, so they are in almost daily contact.
His stepkids, Dwayne and Rachel, might have keys too. And the only other person I could think of is Hannah.
That's Hannah Morrison, Jimmy's new girlfriend.
Thank you so much for talking to us, Easter. You're free to go.
Detectives put Megan and Hannah at the top of their list of people to talk to and head back across the street to the crime scene.
Lieutenant, I think I might have something here for you.
On the way, a deputy who's been canvassing the neighborhood reports back with a potential clue.
When?
2 nights ago, Wednesday night.
The next door neighbor apparently, heard gunshots.
Where?
He says he'd heard them coming from the direction of Jimmy's house, sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m.
And he looked out the window and didn't really see anything.
Once back in the house, detectives dig into Jimmy's cell phone to see if he had made any calls past the time when the neighbor heard the shots.
The last known communication that Jimmy ever had was with Hannah, and it was a text.
Hannah and Jimmy had texted back and forth until their final communication at 8:47 p.m., around the time the neighbor heard gunshots. Investigators now believe they have a date and time of the murder. And with her number at hand, they immediately call Hannah from Jimmy's living room.
Hello?
Is Hannah Morrison?
Yes, this is Hannah Morrison.
I'm afraid I have some bad news.
Jimmy has been killed.
This cannot be true. I don't believe it.
And she got very upset. But she did kind of clean up pretty quick and was able to recuperate herself and talk to me a little bit more.
I hope in any way that I can.
Hannah says that she lives in Nashville, 3 hours away.
I've been at home since I last saw Jimmy 2 weeks ago.
She says she and Jimmy met at a church event, and they'd been in a long-distance relationship for about 5 months.
When she did come in town, she would actually stay at a hotel, kind of what I guess in today's world is kind of old school dating. He was just a gentleman to her.
Hannah claims she's never had a key to Jimmy's house. It's only recently that things had grown more serious between them. That's because Jimmy was finally taking steps to divorce his wife, Megan, after being separated from her for 4 years.
He was excited about her and excited about the relationship. Jimmy decided to go ahead and file the paperwork.
Did it bother you that he was still married?
I was never comfortable with it.
Police wonder if Jimmy's friendly relationship with Megan made her uneasy.
Did that bother you?
It didn't make me happy.
I don't think she liked the fact that they still spoke fairly cordially. I think that she was really pressing him, you need to move on.
Jealousy is a powerful emotion. Could an argument between Jimmy and Hannah over his soon-to-be ex-wife have turned violent? When they begin asking her questions about Jimmy's personal habits...
Do you know what the towel in Jimmy's front door was used for?
He would stuff that towel under the door jamb to keep the draft out. It always got pushed aside.
Hannah seems almost too familiar with his daily routine, especially for someone who claims never to have stayed over at his house.
And it piqued my interest because she was very specific about where certain items would be.
Close the garage door behind him, he'd come in and
He would never use the front door.
put that briefcase on the
He would bring his work bags in and set them on the small love seat in the den.
turn on the TV.
She's given extremely detailed information about what we're actually looking at live. How did she know this much about the crime scene?
Never even take his shoes off. He would just
Now highly suspicious, detectives wonder if Jimmy's girlfriend had been stalking him, trying to find the right time to strike.
We got on the ball and I was like, we have to figure out everything we can about her.
We need to find out where Hannah Morrison was on Wednesday night.
In February 2013, hours after the murder of beloved high school teacher and basketball coach Jimmy McClain of Cordova, Tennessee, detectives are on the hunt for their first lead. Though friends and family insist Jimmy never had an enemy in the world, Shelby County Police are suspicious of his long-distance girlfriend, Hannah Morrison.
Miss Hannah Morrison?
While at the house and speaking to Hannah over the phone, it was odd because she was being very descriptive on certain items in the house.
He closed the garage door behind
Hannah's detailed account is uncanny,
put that briefcase on the
describing exactly what investigators are seeing at the crime scene.
Thank you for calling.
As soon as we got off the phone with her, had my detectives doing a search warrant on her cell phone.
Checking the cell tower transmissions will tell them whether Hannah was in Nashville at the time of Jimmy's murder. And it turns out she was 3 hours away, as she claimed to be.
We got those records back fairly quick from the phone company within 3 to 4 hours, and her phone actually was in Nashville.
There was no question that she did not commit the homicide. She was in a different city.
With Jimmy's new girlfriend in the clear, investigators turn to his estranged wife, Megan. It's very possible she's angry Jimmy had a new girlfriend and was finally moving on. The day after Jimmy's body is found, investigators bring Megan and her children, 25-year-old Rachel and 20-year-old Dwayne, into the station for questioning. All of them potentially have access to the house.
In a case like this, you're always looking at the closest people to the victim.
Tell me how long you and Jimmy have been separated.
For about 4 years.
When asked about her separation from Jimmy, Megan explains that over their 11-year marriage, they had simply grown apart.
And what led to the separation?
Jimmy was very strict. My kids weren't used to that.
There was a significant difference in Jimmy and Megan's parenting style. He was having disagreements with Megan about this because Megan felt that he was too hard on the kids.
So they wasn't used to strict discipline, and this type of person Jimmy was.
The situation had grown so toxic that 5 years earlier, Jimmy told Dwayne he had to leave the house. Not long after, Megan and Rachel leave as well. Megan claims that even though things hadn't worked out, she held no anger toward Jimmy.
And we were friends. We were in a really good place.
Nor did she care that he had a new woman in his life.
She knew that he was dating another lady at the time. She did not seem ill-willed about that.
So you still have a key to his place?
Oh, heavens, no.
If she had a key, she didn't know where it was. She said that she'd been over there, but she would never let herself in.
Detectives cut to the chase.
Do you have anything to gain by his death?
Yeah.
The question throws her off, but she admits the house now belongs to her.
And he had a life insurance policy.
And since they're still married, she's due for a $400,000 payout.
There's an insurance policy in which the soon-to-be ex-wife was still the beneficiary.
The life insurance policy was still valid up until the end of the divorce, and she was the beneficiary.
Meaning there's a strong motive to kill Jimmy before the divorce is final. When asked where she was the night of the murder, Megan says that around 5 o'clock she got off work, went straight home, and stayed there for the rest of the night.
Hey, Mom.
Hey, honey, how are you?
She had seen her son for a little bit, and she kind of went to her own bedroom and read a book, just didn't really mess with anything.
Dwayne, you know, he can actually verify that.
Before Megan leaves, she allows police to copy the information stored on her cell phone to prove her whereabouts. Detectives next turn to Jimmy's 20-year-old stepson, Dwayne, who says he doesn't have a cell phone. And when asked about his relationship with Jimmy,
Jimmy and I were definitely cool.
Despite their differences, he didn't hold a grudge against his stepfather.
Yeah, Jimmy and I were cool.
Dwayne appeared remorseful, and he didn't say anything bad about Jimmy. He didn't talk in a negative sense.
And like his mother, Dwayne claims that he hasn't been in Jimmy's house in a long time.
Had to been years.
We did ask Dwayne, like we asked everybody, did you still have a key to the house? Because we know that he lived there at one time. And Dwayne advised he did not have a key.
Where were you the night that Jimmy was killed? I was home all night.
On the night of Jimmy's murder, Dwayne says he hadn't done much of anything.
That night, he said that he was home and had no visitors.
Dwayne also confirms his mother's story.
Hey, Mom, how was your day?
Hey, baby, it was tiring.
He says, when my mom got home around 5 o'clock, I saw her, and then I didn't see her the rest of the evening.
All I want to do is read my book and go to bed. So I'm going to call it an early night.
So their stories were consistent with each other, except for the fact that during the time frame of the incident that nobody else saw them during those times.
You mind if we take a look at your cell phone?
When investigators talk to Jimmy's stepdaughter, Rachel, she claims that she was at home with her toddler son all night.
We'll be right back with this.
And it doesn't take investigators long to clear her.
She lived a good 15 to 20 miles away, and we were able to clearly show that she was where she was supposed to be all that evening. It was consistent with her locations hitting off the towers.
Having talked to everyone they know who has possible access to Jimmy's house, investigators still desperately need a break in the case. Over the next week, they continue to search for any possible leads, only to come up empty.
They posted flyers in Jimmy's neighborhood, talked to his barber, talked to everybody, and there's simply nothing there.
10 days after the murder, the funeral service for Jimmy McClain takes place at the Midtown Church of Christ in Memphis.
And we get there, and it was 1,000 people. The church was packed. And I think that that's when it first really hit me that Jimmy wasn't going to come back to us.
The memorial turns into a celebration of Jimmy's life and a service to his community, family, friends, and church.
I didn't realize so many people loved and respected Jimmy. Jimmy was an awesome guy.
Among the attendees are Jimmy's former teammates, along with his students and basketball players from Ridgeway High School.
He was very passionate about working with kids. Jimmy was a very giving guy.
Looking for a fresh lead, investigators visit Jimmy's school to question those who interacted with him on a daily basis.
No, I can't think of anybody that would want to hurt him. He was just an incredible guy.
Very great teacher and great coach.
As investigators talk to Jimmy's students and team, they're shocked to hear one theory about what happened to their coach over and over again.
Everyone's been saying Nathan had something to do with it.
Who is he, another basketball player?
Yeah, he just joined a couple months back.
What was that last name again?
Nathan Marks.
There was some controversy with a certain basketball player at Ridgeway. This kid had illegally enrolled into the school.
Nathan Marks is in his 20s, too old to be in high school. In the hopes of getting a basketball scholarship to college, Nathan lied about his age and found a way to enroll at Ridgeway. Someone had revealed his deception, and as a result, he'd been expelled from the school.
They were a good basketball team, and this whole team was going to have to forfeit their whole season because of this situation.
Everybody is talking about it.
The word around school is that Coach McLean was the person who exposed the scam.
It was brought up by numerous students that Nathan might have had something to do with this.
At first, investigators see it as nothing more than overactive teenage imagination until the forensic testing comes back from the lab. Though only Jimmy's DNA and fingerprints show up in the house, the cast from the shoe print turns up something interesting.
They were able to develop the ridge detail on the print, and they were able to establish this was a particular type of shoe.
It's a size 10 or 11 men's athletic shoe, the kind a basketball player would wear. And what at first sounded like a far-fetched rumor swirling around Nathan Marks suddenly takes on a whole new meaning.
There was some serious thought that this could be our guy. It was a plausible explanation as to what happened.
Is this the reason why Jimmy died?
In the weeks after Jimmy McLean's murder, people in his quiet neighborhood in Cordova, Tennessee, are anxiously following the police investigation, terrified that such a violent crime could happen just a few doors away.
They were scared. They wanted to know that they could go to bed not worrying about their family members.
This was a case that could have easily gone unsolved. This is a type of murder that could have easily gone cold.
But investigators now have a solid lead. They're laser-focused on Nathan Marks, a high school basketball player who lied about his age to play on the team Jimmy coached. Investigators are trying to figure out if Nathan suspected his coach of exposing his deception. There's just one problem. Nathan has lawyered up.
We had to verify that Nathan's situation either was part of this murder or had nothing to do with it. And it wasn't an easy task due to the fact that Nathan was not going to speak with us.
Detectives find another way.
I'll let him know.
Nathan's guardian, 34-year-old Lydia Kaufman, the person who vouched for Nathan when he enrolled at Ridgeway High. When investigators pay Lydia a visit, she immediately drops a bombshell.
I'm Nathan's wife.
Nathan was actually married to Lydia, and it was actually Lydia was the one that exposed Nathan.
And why did you do that?
Lydia claims Nathan was cheating on her, and she'd gotten mad when she found out.
He had it coming.
All the stuff that she did to get Nathan into the school and sign his paperwork and basically put herself in a bad situation, she exposed it due to the fact of Nathan's actions.
I got angry.
Although she believes her husband is a lying cheat, Lydia insists he's not a killer.
He moved to Memphis a while ago.
She says Nathan wasn't anywhere near Cordova the night of Jimmy's murder. He had long since packed up and moved away. Though they're not able to speak directly with Nathan, investigators do subpoena his cell phone information. And when the records come in, the tower locations confirm Lydia's claim.
Nothing clicked that Nathan was anywhere near the location of the homicide, that there was any kind of conversations between Jimmy and Nathan. Nathan was not involved in the situation.
Lieutenant Kevin Helms is back at square one, but sitting on his desk are the records he's been waiting for. In addition to downloading call information straight from Jimmy's estranged wife Megan's phone, investigators subpoenaed the full records.
We actually started getting some records back from the phone companies.
When he compares the information he pulled directly from Megan's phone to the records sent from the phone company, Lieutenant Helms notices a glaring discrepancy on the night of Jimmy's murder.
They were able to verify that there were certain communications that had been deleted out of the phone.
It's a huge discovery. Apparently, Megan has deliberately deleted information stored on her cell phone.
There were 2 individual numbers that we started seeing that there was text communication. Why are these numbers deleted, and who are these individuals?
Using the company records, investigators traced the deleted calls and texts back to a woman named Shayna Lambert and a man, Hank Mitchell, a known drug dealer with a criminal record. It doesn't look good for Megan.
We've looked at your cell phone record.
But when she's confronted with this new information, she goes on the defensive, revealing something she neglected to point out in her last interview.
To be honest, I don't know what the messages were. Normally, my son, Dwayne, has my phone.
On most evenings, including the night Jimmy died, she lets her son, Dwayne, use her phone.
Oh, Mom, can I borrow this?
Her son did not have a cell phone. She would keep the phone all day long, and then when she would get home, her son then would acquire the phone and use it for himself.
Love you.
Love you too.
So according to Megan, any texts and calls after she got home from work belonged to Dwayne, including the deleted messages.
Who are these people?
She tells them that Shayna is Dwayne's girlfriend, and Hank is his best friend.
Yeah, he talks to them every day.
The phone records revealed that various text messages and conversations had occurred that night between Hank and Dwayne.
He has been communicating with Dwayne, at about the time of the murder.
Where was Dwayne?
Then Megan changes something else in her story.
I'm not sure where he went, but he did go out for a little while that night.
And investigators drag out that she's been protecting her son.
Dwayne, in fact, had not been at home that whole entire night, the night that the homicide was committed.
I was at home.
Dwayne's story has been that he was home all night.
So that was all of a sudden a red flag. Why would Dwayne tell us that?
That day, investigators reach out to Dwayne. This time, he refuses to talk. So police immediately secure a search warrant for the apartment he shares with his mother, Megan.
And our goal there was to find any kind of forensic evidence to tie that to the homicide scene. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything whatsoever.
With nothing tying Dwayne to the murder, detectives turn their attention to the one person he communicated with around the time Jimmy was killed, his best friend, Hank. Hoping he'll lead them to new evidence, police stake out his home. But it doesn't take long for Hank to figure out he's being watched.
He decides to calmly walk out the house and try to walk away, but of course, the authorities figured out that he had gotten onto them.
And when they went to talk to Hank, he attempted to flee.
What Hank does next will unlock the mystery and reveal the killer's shocking identity.
Evil is real, and sometimes evil comes in sheep's clothing.
In the quiet Tennessee town of Cordova, police are tailing a new suspect in the murder investigation of Jimmy McClain. Hank Mitchell, best friend of Jimmy's stepson Dwayne, is attempting to shake off police surveillance. And as he flees, investigators see him toss something away.
He even discarded a firearm that he had thrown a gun away.
Thinking it might be the murder weapon, police tackle Hank. And a quick search reveals he has illegal drugs on him. After taking him into custody, officers retrieve the gun Hank tried to get rid of and confiscate his cell phone. And when detectives try to question him, he's less than cooperative.
I want my lawyer, man. I plead the fifth.
Hank became very belligerent. He wanted a lawyer. He laughed. He wasn't going to give up any information. He was booked and charged with a felony narcotics and a felon in possession of a handgun.
Forensic analysis determines that Hank's gun is not the one used in Jimmy's murder. But they're able to dig into the call log on his cell phone and discover that Dwayne isn't the only person trying to hide something.
They realize that he has a bunch of deleted messages on his phone also.
Investigators can't retrieve the missing texts, but they are able to extract a handful of deleted photos from Hank's phone. One of them makes their jaws drop.
They had found a picture of a gun like the one used to murder Jimmy. It was time and date stamped, the morning of Jimmy's murder.
Even more striking is what the Smith & Wesson pistol is laying on. Something that catches the eye of one of the investigators who searched Dwayne and his mother's apartment.
As we're looking at it, staring us right in the face, it's this bedspread.
But not just any bedspread, on Dwayne's bedspread.
Now, investigators need to locate the gun. With Dwayne and Hank both refusing to speak with police, detectives decide to monitor Hank's calls from jail, hoping he'll let something slip.
Hey, Victor, it's Hank.
3 days after Hank is processed into the jail, he makes a call to a known criminal named Victor Schultz.
Hey, I wish I would have knew that night, bro. When he sold you that pit bull, I would have said, nah, that pit bull is sick. You know what I'm saying? Real talk.
Hank started telling Victor, you need to get rid of that pit bull that Bra sold you.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
After listening to his previous phone calls, investigators already know that Hank's nickname for Dwayne is Bra. The rest of the conversation is in street code.
They were talking about a gun, the pit bull being the gun, the fact that it's sick, meaning it had been used in some sort of crime, and you need to get rid of it because the police are going to be looking for it.
Having dealt with Victor before on prior arrests, detectives know where to find him. With a search warrant in hand, they immediately go to his house, only to find that Victor isn't home.
Victor's mother advised us that Victor was kicked out of the house 2 to 3 days before.
Detectives search the house anyway, and on the top shelf of Victor's closet, they find a shoebox.
Hey, I've got something.
He opens it up, and there lays a Smith & Wesson Sigma 40 caliber, the exact same model that looked like the picture off of the bedspread.
Not only have they found a weapon, but in it are 40 caliber bullets, the same used to kill Jimmy.
I think we got it.
Investigators take everything to the forensic team for analysis,
where they compared shell casings and projectiles that were found on the scene, and within 8 hours, they confirmed that this gun was the gun that was used in the homicide of Jimmy McClain. We were ecstatic.
Investigators believe they've found their killer. There's just one more piece of the puzzle missing: the muddy footprint at Jimmy's house. Does Dwayne own the type of athletic shoe that left the print? Detectives found nothing when they searched his apartment, so they visit his girlfriend, Shayna Lambert, to see if she has any information.
Do you know if he owned any fancy brand name athletic shoes?
I just kind of shot the question out there and shot in the dark.
He loves those shoes.
She said those are his favorite shoes. He saved up his money to buy them.
He wears them all the time.
Turns out, according to Shayna, Dwayne wears a size 10.5, the same as the print found at Jimmy's house. Though investigators never recover the shoes, they believe they have enough evidence to arrest Jimmy's stepson. On March 26, 2013, Dwayne Moore is arrested and charged with the second-degree murder of his stepfather, Jimmy McClain. Dwayne denies having anything to do with the crime. Jimmy's family, who've watched him grow up, are stunned.
When I found out it was Dwayne, it didn't make me feel good. Evil is real. And, sometimes evil comes in sheep's clothing. And that's really sad.
At Dwayne's trial in June 2014, prosecutors argue that he murdered his stepfather out of greed.
Dwayne's motive for murdering Jimmy was probably insurance money that he was going to share with his mom. And then her getting the house Jimmy was living in at the time that he was killed.
Prosecutors then lay out their theory of what happened the night of Jimmy's murder. On February 20th, 2013, Dwayne watches outside of Jimmy's house, waiting for him to come home. Around 8:30 p.m., his stepfather pulls into the driveway.
Jimmy had parked in his garage, had shut the door, had come inside, had sat down on his couch.
Dwayne lets himself in the front door with his house key, catching his stepfather by surprise. When Jimmy sees the gun, he tries to run. Dwayne keeps on coming.
The gun. Give me
There was zero defensive moves on Jimmy's behalf.
Once Jimmy falls, Dwayne pumps him full of rounds. When he's sure Jimmy is dead, Dwayne leaves, locking the door behind him.
Jimmy did not deserve this. Jimmy didn't deserve to be killed like that. It made it so sad because Jimmy was the kind of guy who would work out his issues with anyone.
On June 27, 2014, Dwayne Moore is convicted of Jimmy McClain's murder. In October, he's sentenced to 22 years in prison without parole. Though Victor testifies at the trial, neither he, Megan, Hank, nor Shayna are ever charged with any crime related to Jimmy's murder. Though justice is served, friends and family will never recover.
For me, it's left a void. He was my best friend. So I've lost a part of me, a huge part of me.
He was everything to me. There's a hole in my heart that I don't think will ever be filled. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him.
Since that day, most everything I do now, I put in my mind, I try to dedicate it and do it for Jimmy.
As they try to put this tragedy behind them, the people in Cordova will never forget Jimmy McClain and the terror that shook their community.
I don't think that it'll be soon that they'll get over it, because it was something that just doesn't happen in that kind of neighborhood.
I drove through that area where Jimmy got murdered. It was a really, really eerie feeling to know that my friend was just murdered senselessly in this area for no reason.
There are crimes that dominate headlines for weeks, disappear from public attention, and slowly fade into history. Then there are crimes that refuse to disappear. Cases that linger in police archives for decades, haunting detectives long after witnesses have grown old and evidence has begun to deteriorate. Every unanswered question becomes part of a family's daily life. Every birthday, every anniversary, every empty chair serves as another reminder that justice never arrived. For nearly half a century, the murder of Karen Stitt belonged to that second category. For decades, investigators possessed evidence, but no identity. They had fragments of a story without knowing the person responsible for writing its final chapter. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited boxes of reports compiled by people they had never met. Scientific methods changed dramatically, transforming what once seemed impossible into routine laboratory work. Yet despite those advances, one crucial question remained unanswered. Who killed Karen Stitt? The answer would not emerge from a confession, a forgotten witness, or an anonymous tip. Instead, it would arrive through a scientific approach that did not even exist when the crime occurred. A technology capable of connecting distant relatives, separated by generations, would eventually reshape one of California's oldest unsolved homicide investigations. But before that breakthrough became possible, there was a young woman whose life ended violently in 1972, leaving behind a mystery that would span nearly 50 years. Karen Stitt was only 15 years old. She lived in an era very different from today. Southern California in the early 1970s projected an image of endless opportunity. The region was expanding rapidly. New neighborhoods appeared every year. Teenagers gathered at shopping centers, football games, beaches, and community events. Families believed that ordinary routines offered a reasonable sense of safety. It was a time before mobile phones, before surveillance cameras covered intersections, before digital records documented nearly every movement. Young people enjoyed a degree of independence that would later become uncommon. Karen was one of thousands of teenagers navigating school, friendships, family expectations, and the uncertainty of adolescence. Those who knew her remembered a girl whose future had barely begun. Like every 15-year-old, her plans stretched much farther than anyone could imagine. None of those plans included becoming the center of one of California's longest-running homicide investigations. The events that followed unfolded quickly. During the early morning hours of September 3rd, 1972, Karen disappeared. At first, disappearances involving teenagers often produced uncertainty. Families wondered whether an argument had prompted someone to stay with friends. Investigators had to distinguish between ordinary teenage behavior and genuine danger. Hours mattered, yet certainty rarely came immediately. In Karen's case, that uncertainty did not last long. Later that same day, her body was discovered in a remote area near the Ortega Highway in Orange County, California. The location immediately raised difficult questions. It was isolated enough to suggest that whoever left her there wanted distance from public view. Detectives arriving at the scene faced the familiar but daunting responsibility of preserving every possible piece of evidence before weather, animals, or human activity could destroy it forever. Every footprint, every fiber, every biological trace carried the possibility of identifying the person responsible. Crime scene investigators documented everything they could observe: the terrain, the position of the body, the surrounding vegetation, nearby tire impressions, potential transfer evidence. At the time, forensic science relied heavily on careful observation. DNA profiling had not yet entered criminal investigations. Detectives depended on fingerprints, blood typing, witness interviews, physical comparisons, and painstaking detective work. Cases frequently succeeded because someone recognized a vehicle, remembered a conversation, or connected seemingly unrelated details. The investigation into Karen Stitt's murder began with exactly those traditional methods. Friends were interviewed. Family members were questioned. People who might have seen Karen during the final hours of her life were identified whenever possible. Investigators attempted to reconstruct her movements minute by minute, hoping that somewhere along that timeline a witness had unknowingly observed something important. Every homicide investigation begins with a simple premise. Someone knows something. The challenge lies in discovering who that person is. As detectives continued gathering information, they also confronted another reality common to violent crimes committed in isolated areas. Physical evidence existed, but interpreting its meaning proved extraordinarily difficult, without a known suspect for comparison. Evidence alone rarely speaks. It requires context. Investigators searched for individuals who may have encountered Karen shortly before her disappearance. They examined reports involving suspicious vehicles. They looked into known offenders active in Southern California during that period. Detectives explored whether the homicide could be connected to other violent crimes committed nearby. Each lead generated additional questions. Each question demanded more interviews. Each interview produced new paperwork. Weeks became months. Months became years. Despite sustained investigative efforts, the identity of Karen's killer remained unknown. For her family, the passage of time created a different kind of burden. Unlike cases that reach courtrooms, unsolved homicides deny families a clear ending. There is no verdict, no sentencing hearing, no public accounting of what happened. Instead, grief becomes permanently intertwined with uncertainty. The absence of answers often proves almost as painful as the crime itself. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies continued preserving the physical evidence collected in 1972. That decision would later prove invaluable. During the early 1970s, detectives could not possibly anticipate how dramatically forensic science would evolve. Evidence that appeared to have limited usefulness then would eventually become central to solving the case decades later. Storage procedures, chain of custody documentation, and laboratory preservation practices ensured that crucial biological material survived long after many witnesses' memories had faded. Throughout the following years, investigators periodically revisited the file. Cold case work differs significantly from active investigations. Instead of responding to new crimes, detectives examine old reports with fresh eyes. They reread interview transcripts, reconsider discarded theories, and evaluate whether technological advances might reveal information that earlier investigators could never have obtained. Every few years, scientific progress encouraged another review. Fingerprint databases expanded. Computerized record systems improved. National criminal databases grew more comprehensive. DNA analysis eventually transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. For Karen Stitt's investigation, DNA represented hope. But hope alone could not identify an unknown offender. Traditional DNA comparisons require a reference sample. Detectives needed either a suspect whose DNA could be compared with evidence recovered from the crime scene or a matching profile already stored in a criminal database. Neither condition initially existed. Laboratories successfully developed DNA profiles from preserved evidence, confirming that biological material from the offender had survived. That was an extraordinary achievement. Yet investigators still lacked a name. Years continued passing. Children born after Karen's death reached adulthood. Some became parents themselves. Entire generations grew up unaware that an unsolved homicide from 1972 remained active inside Orange County investigative files. Behind the scenes, detectives refused to close the case. Cold case units understand an important principle. Time changes evidence in unpredictable ways. Witnesses who once remained silent may eventually decide to speak. Relationships change. Loyalties disappear. Scientific capabilities improve. Information that once seemed insignificant may later become decisive. Karen Stitt's case exemplified that reality. Although public attention diminished over the decades, the investigation itself never truly ended. Files were maintained. Evidence was preserved. Detectives continued searching for opportunities to apply emerging forensic methods whenever resources allowed. By the early 21st century, forensic DNA analysis had already solved numerous long-unsolved murders throughout the United States. Cases dating back to the 1960s and 1970s suddenly reached courtrooms because biological evidence had been carefully preserved. Still, Karen's case resisted resolution. The DNA profile existed. The killer's identity did not. Investigators found themselves confronting a remarkable paradox. They possessed biological evidence from the person responsible for the murder, yet they had no idea who that individual was. It was as if the offender had left behind a signature written in a language science had only recently learned to read, but without a dictionary to translate it into a name. For years, that remained the central obstacle. The investigation had reached the limits of conventional forensic comparison. To move forward, detectives would eventually need an entirely different approach, one that reached beyond criminal databases and instead looked into the unexpected connections hidden within ordinary family histories. Before that breakthrough could happen, however, nearly 5 decades would pass, and the murder of 15-year-old Karen Stitt would continue to stand as one of Orange County's enduring cold cases, a reminder that some investigations survive not because the evidence disappears, but because the final piece of the puzzle has yet to be recognized. As the years passed, the investigation into the murder of Karen Stitt entered what detectives often describe as the cold case phase. The term can be misleading. A case is not forgotten simply because it is no longer making headlines. In many law enforcement agencies, an unsolved homicide remains open indefinitely. Detectives retire, new investigators take their place, and every preserved piece of evidence is viewed as a potential opportunity rather than a closed chapter. Karen's case followed that path. The Orange County Sheriff's Department retained the evidence collected in September 1972 with the expectation that future scientific advances might provide answers unavailable at the time of the crime. This decision reflected an important principle of homicide investigations. Evidence should be preserved whenever possible because investigative techniques evolve. The decades after Karen's death witnessed extraordinary changes in forensic science. During the 1980s, DNA profiling emerged as a revolutionary investigative tool. By the 1990s, it had become an established method for identifying suspects, excluding innocent individuals, and linking crimes committed by the same offender. Biological evidence that had once yielded only limited information could now generate a unique genetic profile. For older investigations, however, success depended on the condition of the preserved evidence. Many cases from the 1960s and 1970s had been compromised by environmental exposure or storage practices that reflected the standards of their time. Some biological samples had degraded beyond scientific usefulness. Others remained intact, offering investigators a second chance decades after the crime occurred. Karen Stitt's case belonged to the latter group. Forensic scientists were able to obtain a DNA profile from biological evidence associated with the homicide. This represented a major investigative milestone. It confirmed that material attributable to the offender had survived for decades, creating the possibility of future identification. Yet obtaining a DNA profile and identifying a suspect are not the same process. Investigators first compared the profile against available law enforcement databases. These systems contain DNA from many convicted offenders and, depending on jurisdiction and applicable laws, from individuals arrested for certain offenses. A match can immediately identify a suspect if that person's profile has previously been entered into the system. No such match was found. The absence of a database hit suggested several possibilities. The offender may never have been convicted of a qualifying offense, may never have submitted a DNA sample under applicable laws, or may have died before such requirements existed. Whatever the explanation, conventional database searching did not provide investigators with a name. The case remained unsolved. Even so, advances in forensic technology continued to improve the quality of genetic analysis. Laboratories became capable of recovering useful information from increasingly small or degraded biological samples. Older evidence could sometimes be re-examined using methods unavailable only a few years earlier. At the same time, another scientific development began attracting attention within the investigative community: genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic DNA comparison, which searches for an exact match within criminal databases, investigative genetic genealogy examines shared DNA between biological relatives. Individuals who voluntarily upload their genetic information to certain genealogy services may unknowingly create distant family connections that can assist in identifying unknown individuals. The approach first gained widespread public attention through several high-profile cold case investigations in the late 2010s. Law enforcement agencies recognized that unknown offenders who had never entered the criminal justice system might nevertheless be identifiable through relatives whose DNA had been submitted for genealogical purposes. This represented a significant shift in investigative strategy. Instead of asking whether the suspect's DNA existed in a criminal database, detectives could ask whether any biological relatives appeared within genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement use under applicable policies. The answer would not immediately identify the offender. It would instead generate a family tree. From there, investigators would rely on historical records, census information, birth certificates, marriage records, military records, newspaper archives, obituaries, and countless other public documents to narrow the possibilities. The process demands extraordinary patience. Professional genealogists may spend months constructing family histories extending across multiple generations. Every branch must be verified. Every relationship must be documented. Individuals are systematically eliminated based on age, sex, geography, and other known facts surrounding the investigation. It is both scientific and historical research. For Karen Stitt's case, this approach eventually became a realistic option. By then, nearly 5 decades had passed since her death. The world in which the crime occurred had changed almost beyond recognition. Neighborhoods had expanded. Roadways had been rebuilt. Businesses that existed in 1972 had disappeared. Many original witnesses had grown elderly, while some investigators who first worked the case were no longer alive. Yet the preserved evidence remained. The DNA profile generated from that evidence continued to represent the strongest investigative lead available. Detectives assigned to the cold case recognized that modern forensic genealogy offered an opportunity unavailable to previous generations of investigators. Rather than waiting for the offender's DNA to appear in a criminal database, they could pursue identification through biological relatives. This strategy required careful legal review and close collaboration between investigators, forensic laboratories, and genealogical specialists. The work proceeded methodically. Once potential family connections were identified, genealogists began constructing extensive family trees. These trees often included hundreds of individuals spanning multiple generations. Investigators then compared those family histories with the known facts of Karen Stitt's homicide. Who was alive in 1972? Who was an adult male at the time? Who had connections to Southern California? Who could reasonably have been present in Orange County during the period of the crime? Every question narrowed the field. The process illustrates an important characteristic of investigative genetic genealogy. DNA alone rarely names a suspect. Instead, it provides biological relationships that must be interpreted through extensive documentary research and traditional detective work. As the family tree became more refined, investigators focused on increasingly smaller groups of individuals whose age, location, and life histories aligned with the available evidence. Eventually, attention centered on one man. At this stage, however, genealogical research alone was insufficient. Law enforcement agencies generally seek independent confirmation before publicly identifying a suspect. Detectives therefore pursued additional investigative steps designed to obtain a direct DNA comparison using legally appropriate methods. Such confirmation is critical. A genealogical connection can point investigators in the right direction, but a direct comparison between the suspect's DNA and the crime scene evidence provides the scientific basis for identification. For Karen Stitt's case, investigators ultimately obtained that comparison. The result confirmed that the DNA recovered from the preserved evidence was consistent with the individual identified through genealogical research. Nearly 50 years after Karen's death, the investigation had achieved what generations of detectives had pursued. The unknown offender finally had a name. The identification represented not only a breakthrough in one homicide investigation, but also an illustration of how advances in forensic science continue to reshape the investigation of historical crimes. Cases once believed unsolvable may, under the right circumstances, become candidates for renewed examination as technology evolves. For Karen Stitt's family, however, the scientific achievement carried a far more personal significance. After decades without answers, investigators could finally explain who had been responsible for the crime that had remained unresolved since 1972. The investigation had reached a milestone that earlier generations of detectives could scarcely have imagined, demonstrating that careful evidence preservation, combined with modern forensic genealogy and persistent investigative work, could bridge nearly half a century between an unsolved homicide and the identification of the person responsible. Identifying a suspect after nearly 50 years was not the end of the investigation. In many ways, it marked the beginning of an entirely different phase. For decades, detectives had worked with an unknown offender. Once investigators believed they had identified the individual through investigative genetic genealogy, every conclusion had to be independently verified using established forensic and investigative procedures. Modern genealogy can generate powerful leads, but those leads must be supported by evidence that would withstand legal scrutiny. Investigators therefore reviewed the case from the beginning. Original reports prepared in 1972 were examined alongside laboratory records created decades later. Detectives compared historical witness statements, physical evidence inventories, and forensic findings with the information developed through genealogical research. The objective was not simply to identify a possible suspect, but to determine whether the available evidence formed a consistent and reliable picture. According to the Orange County Sheriff's Department, that process ultimately led investigators to Gary Allen Scarra, who had been an adult living in Southern California at the time Karen Stitt was killed. Through additional investigation and DNA comparison, detectives concluded that the biological evidence recovered in the case was consistent with Scarra. By the time this conclusion was reached, however, Scarra was no longer alive. He had died years before the public announcement identifying him. This circumstance illustrates one of the recurring challenges in cold case investigations. Scientific advances may eventually answer the central question of who committed a crime, but they cannot reverse the passage of time. In some investigations, suspects die before they can be questioned or prosecuted. As a result, the criminal justice process cannot proceed in the way it would have if the offender had been identified while still living. For Karenstidt's family, the announcement therefore represented a form of resolution rather than a criminal trial. There would be no courtroom testimony, no jury, no verdict. Instead, the findings were presented through the investigative conclusions reached by law enforcement after decades of work. When authorities publicly identified Scarra in 2021, they also explained the role played by investigative genetic genealogy. The case became another example of how this relatively new forensic approach had transformed the investigation of historical homicides throughout the United States. The method itself is the product of several different disciplines. Forensic scientists recover and analyze biological evidence. Genealogists reconstruct family relationships using publicly available historical records and DNA matches from individuals who have voluntarily submitted their genetic information to genealogy services that permit law enforcement use under applicable policies. Detectives then integrate those findings with conventional investigative techniques, including background research, document review, interviews when possible, and confirmatory DNA testing. No single component solves the case by itself. Rather, each contributes to a broader investigative process. The identification of Scarra also prompted renewed public discussion about the importance of evidence preservation. Had the biological material collected in 1972 been lost or contaminated, later scientific advances would have had little value. The successful use of DNA decades later depended on decisions made by crime scene personnel and evidence custodians long before anyone could have anticipated the development of modern forensic genetics. In this respect, the Karenstidt investigation demonstrates how criminal investigations often extend across generations. The deputies who first responded to the crime scene in 1972 could not have predicted the emergence of DNA profiling, let alone investigative genetic genealogy. Yet their careful documentation and preservation of evidence created the foundation upon which future investigators were able to build. Equally important was the continuity of the investigation itself. Although public attention diminished over time, the case remained officially open. Cold case investigators periodically reviewed the evidence as forensic capabilities improved. Each technological advance created another opportunity to reconsider material that had already been collected. Many cold cases never benefit from such circumstances. Some lack recoverable biological evidence. Others involve evidence that has deteriorated beyond scientific usefulness. In still other investigations, the offender may have left no biological material capable of generating a DNA profile. Karenstidt's case was different because investigators possessed preserved evidence that remained suitable for increasingly sophisticated analysis. The public announcement in 2021 also reflected changing attitudes toward unsolved homicide investigations. Historically, many older cases were viewed as unlikely ever to be resolved. Advances in forensic science have altered that expectation. Law enforcement agencies across the United States now routinely reassess historical investigations in light of new technologies, particularly where preserved biological evidence exists. As a result, cases once considered dormant may again become active. The Karenstidt investigation is frequently cited alongside other cold cases solved through investigative genetic genealogy, illustrating the broader impact of this investigative approach. It also highlights the collaborative nature of modern forensic investigations. No single detective solved the case. Instead, the eventual identification resulted from the combined efforts of patrol deputies, crime scene investigators, laboratory scientists, evidence technicians, genealogists, prosecutors, and successive generations of cold case detectives who maintained the investigation over nearly 5 decades. For Karen's family, the public identification of the suspect could not erase the loss they experienced in 1972. What it could provide was an answer to the question that had remained unresolved for almost half a century. Law enforcement officials acknowledged that no announcement could replace the opportunities Karen never had or restore the years taken from her family. Nevertheless, identifying the person responsible represented an important investigative outcome, both for those directly affected and for the detectives who had continued working the case across multiple generations. The investigation also reinforced a broader lesson that has become increasingly evident in the modern era of forensic science. Time alone does not necessarily protect offenders from identification. Advances in DNA technology, combined with meticulous evidence preservation and persistent investigative work, continue to reshape what is possible in criminal investigations. Cases that once appeared destined to remain permanently unsolved may acquire new investigative pathways as scientific methods evolve. The murder of Karen Stitt remains a significant example of that transformation. Although the suspect died before criminal prosecution could occur, the investigation demonstrated how nearly 50 years of technological progress and institutional persistence ultimately answered the central question that had remained unresolved since September 1972. The identity of the man whom investigators concluded was responsible for her death. The resolution of the Karen Stitt investigation became part of a broader transformation in American criminal investigations. During the late 2010s and early 2020s, law enforcement agencies increasingly revisited long unsolved homicides with the expectation that advances in forensic genetics might reveal information unavailable to earlier investigators. The success of these efforts did not depend solely on new technology. It also reflected decades of careful evidence preservation, improved laboratory techniques, and collaboration among investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and professional genealogists. Investigative genetic genealogy differs from traditional forensic DNA analysis in important ways. Conventional DNA comparisons seek an exact match between biological evidence recovered from a crime scene and a profile contained in a law enforcement database. If no matching profile exists, the search reaches a practical limit. Genetic genealogy follows a different path. Rather than searching for the individual directly, investigators search for biological relatives whose DNA has been voluntarily submitted to genealogy databases that permit law enforcement use under specific conditions. The resulting matches are often distant relatives, rather than close family members. Detectives and genealogists must then reconstruct family histories across multiple generations, identifying where those family lines intersect and narrowing the field of possible individuals through documentary research. This process can require months of work. Historical census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, military records, newspaper archives, cemetery records, obituaries, and public directories may all contribute to reconstructing a family tree. Each record helps investigators eliminate possibilities until only a small number of individuals remain consistent with the available evidence. In Karen Stitt's case, genealogy did not replace conventional police work. Instead, it generated an investigative lead that detectives were then required to verify independently. Once the field had narrowed, investigators obtained a direct DNA comparison through legally authorized means. That comparison provided the scientific confirmation necessary to support the identification announced by the Orange County Sheriff's Department. The investigation illustrates an important principle of modern forensic science. No single technique solves a case in isolation. Crime scene investigators preserve evidence. Laboratory scientists analyze biological material. Genealogists identify potential family relationships. Detectives evaluate historical records, corroborate findings, and reconstruct events using both new and old information. Only when these elements align can investigators confidently identify a suspect. The public announcement in 2021 attracted national attention because it demonstrated how scientific advances continue to reshape the investigation of historical crimes. Cases that once appeared beyond resolution may now become candidates for renewed review if preserved biological evidence remains available. Law enforcement agencies throughout the United States have since expanded cold case initiatives based on this principle. Many departments now maintain dedicated units responsible for reviewing unsolved homicides from previous decades. These units prioritize cases in which biological evidence has been preserved, recognizing that improvements in DNA technology may create investigative opportunities that did not exist when the crimes occurred. Not every case can be solved. Some investigations lack recoverable biological evidence. Others involve evidence that has degraded beyond scientific usefulness. In some instances, the offender left no identifiable DNA at all. The Karen-Stitt investigation succeeded because several factors converged. Evidence collected in 1972 remained suitable for modern testing. Advances in DNA analysis allowed laboratories to generate reliable genetic information. Investigative genetic genealogy provided a new method for developing leads. Traditional detective work confirmed the results. Together, these elements transformed a nearly 50-year-old mystery into an identified homicide suspect. Although the suspect died before prosecution could occur, the investigation still fulfilled one of the central objectives of homicide work, establishing, to the extent supported by the evidence, who was responsible for the crime. For Karen-Stitt's family, that identification represented an answer that had been unavailable for almost 5 decades. While it could not undo the loss they experienced, it resolved a question that had remained open since September 1972. The case also serves as a reminder that cold cases are not static. Even after years or decades without significant developments, they may change rapidly when new forensic capabilities become available. Scientific progress can transform evidence that once appeared exhausted into the foundation of an entirely new investigative strategy. Karen-Stitt's case is therefore significant not only because of its eventual resolution, but because it illustrates the evolving relationship between science and criminal investigation. Each generation of investigators inherited the work of those who came before, preserving records, safeguarding evidence, and maintaining the possibility that future methods might reveal what earlier technology could not. In the end, the investigation became a testament to persistence as much as to scientific innovation. Nearly half a century separated the crime from the identification of the suspect, yet the commitment to preserving evidence and revisiting the case ultimately allowed investigators to answer a question that had remained unresolved for generations. The identification of the suspect in the murder of Karen-Stitt represented the conclusion of one investigation, but it also prompted broader discussion about how forensic science has changed the landscape of criminal justice. Cases once believed to be permanently unsolved are now being reassessed across the United States using investigative methods that did not exist when many of the crimes occurred. One of the most significant lessons from the Karen-Stitt investigation concerns the preservation of evidence. In homicide investigations, physical evidence is often collected with future analysis in mind, even when available technology cannot immediately provide answers. Clothing, biological samples, photographs, laboratory notes, and crime scene documentation may remain in secure storage for decades. Their value is not determined solely by the capabilities of contemporary science, but also by the possibility that future techniques will reveal additional information. This principle proved critical in Karen-Stitt's case. The biological evidence collected in 1972 remained suitable for advanced DNA analysis many years later. Without that preserved evidence, investigative genetic genealogy could not have been used to develop new leads. The case also highlights the importance of continuity within law enforcement. Cold case investigations frequently span multiple generations of detectives. The officers who initially responded to the homicide are often no longer serving when significant breakthroughs occur. Responsibility passes from one investigator to another, each relying on the documentation, evidence management, and professional judgment of those who came before. Maintaining accurate records over long periods is therefore essential. Interview summaries, evidence logs, laboratory reports, photographs, maps, and investigative notes allow future detectives to understand the original investigation and evaluate new information within its proper context. The Karen Stitt investigation demonstrates how this institutional continuity can contribute to solving historical crimes. Another important aspect of the case is the role of interdisciplinary cooperation. Modern cold case investigations rarely depend on a single investigative technique. Instead, they combine expertise from several fields. Forensic biologists analyze biological material recovered from evidence. DNA specialists generate and interpret genetic profiles. Professional genealogists reconstruct family relationships using historical and public records. Detectives compare genealogical findings with investigative information developed over decades. Prosecutors provide legal guidance regarding investigative procedures and evidentiary standards. Each discipline contributes a distinct element to the overall process. The investigation also illustrates the distinction between identifying a suspect and obtaining a criminal conviction. Because the individual identified by investigators had died before the public announcement, criminal prosecution was no longer possible. Under the legal system, a deceased individual cannot be tried in court. Consequently, the investigation concluded with the public identification rather than judicial proceedings. This outcome differs from many homicide cases in which a suspect is arrested, prosecuted, and, if convicted, sentenced following a trial. Even without a prosecution, however, law enforcement agencies may publicly announce investigative conclusions when they determine that available evidence establishes the identity of the offender to the applicable investigative standard. For families, such announcements can provide long-awaited answers despite the absence of courtroom proceedings. The Karen Stitt investigation has also become part of a larger body of cases demonstrating the practical application of investigative genetic genealogy. Since its emergence as an investigative tool, this method has contributed to the resolution of numerous historical homicide investigations, particularly those involving preserved biological evidence. Each successful investigation has expanded understanding of both the capabilities and the limitations of the technique. Importantly, genealogy alone does not establish criminal responsibility. Investigators continue to rely on confirmatory DNA testing and traditional investigative methods before reaching conclusions regarding a suspect's identity. This layered approach helps ensure that investigative findings are supported by multiple forms of evidence rather than by genealogical inference alone. For criminal investigators, Karen Stitt's case reinforces several enduring principles. First, preserve evidence whenever possible. Second, maintain comprehensive investigative records. Third, periodically reassess unresolved cases as forensic science advances. Fourth, recognize that scientific innovation may create opportunities unavailable to previous generations of investigators. These principles now influence cold case programs throughout the United States. Many law enforcement agencies have established specialized units dedicated to reviewing historical homicides in light of modern forensic capabilities. Partnerships with accredited forensic laboratories and experienced genealogists have become increasingly common, particularly in cases where biological evidence remains available for testing. The impact extends beyond individual investigations. Each successfully resolved cold case contributes to the refinement of investigative procedures, laboratory protocols, and evidence preservation standards. Lessons learned from one investigation often inform the handling of future cases, improving the likelihood that additional unsolved homicides may eventually be resolved. Karen Stitt's case remains a notable example of this progression. Although nearly 50 years separated the crime from the identification of the suspect, the investigation demonstrates that unresolved cases need not remain permanently beyond reach. Scientific developments, combined with careful evidence preservation and sustained investigative commitment, can fundamentally alter the prospects of an investigation long after the original crime occurred. For the public, the case serves as a reminder that advances in forensic science continue to reshape criminal investigations, For investigators, it underscores the importance of persistence. And for the family of Karen Stitt, the identification announced decades after her death marked the resolution of a question that had remained unanswered since September 1972, illustrating how determined investigative work and evolving scientific methods can together provide answers even after the passage of nearly half a century. By the time investigators publicly identified the suspect in Karen Stitt's murder in 2021, the case had already become part of the evolving history of forensic science. What had begun in 1972 as a conventional homicide investigation ultimately reflected nearly 5 decades of technological progress, institutional persistence, and changing investigative practices. The announcement was significant not only because an unidentified offender had finally been named, but also because it demonstrated how cold case investigations increasingly rely on methods unavailable to earlier generations of detectives. When Karen was killed, investigators worked within the scientific limitations of the early 1970s. DNA profiling had not yet been developed, computerized criminal databases did not exist in their modern form, and the concept of identifying an unknown suspect through distant biological relatives would have been difficult to imagine. Detectives instead depended on eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, neighborhood canvasses, interviews, and comparisons of fingerprints or blood types. These methods remained fundamental to homicide investigations, but they were constrained by the technology of the period. As forensic science advanced through the 1980s and 1990s, DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations. Biological evidence that previously had limited evidentiary value became a uniquely identifying form of forensic information. This development solved many contemporary cases and reopened numerous historical investigations. Karen Stitt's case was among those that benefited from these advances. The preserved evidence yielded a DNA profile that investigators could compare against law enforcement databases. Although those searches did not initially identify the offender, the existence of the DNA profile ensured that the investigation remained scientifically viable. The next major development came with investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than replacing traditional investigative techniques, genealogy expanded them. It enabled detectives to pursue investigative leads based on biological relationships rather than direct database matches. Family history research, supported by public records and confirmatory forensic testing, became an additional tool within the broader investigative process. The successful application of this method in Karen Stitt's case reflected careful coordination among multiple specialists. Forensic scientists analyzed the biological evidence. Genealogists reconstructed family relationships. Detectives evaluated historical records and investigative files. Laboratories performed confirmatory DNA comparisons. Legal advisors reviewed investigative procedures to ensure compliance with applicable standards. Each stage depended upon the accuracy of the previous one. The investigation also illustrates the importance of evidence management over extended periods. Maintaining biological evidence for decades requires careful documentation, secure storage, and consistent chain of custody procedures. Without these safeguards, later forensic analysis may be impossible or legally unreliable. Evidence preservation is therefore not merely an administrative function. It is an essential component of long-term criminal investigation. Karen Stitt's case demonstrates how decisions made in the earliest stages of an investigation may influence its outcome decades later. The investigation likewise underscores the value of institutional memory. Although individual detectives may retire, homicide investigations often continue under successive teams of investigators. Comprehensive case files allow new detectives to understand earlier investigative decisions, review previous leads, and integrate modern forensic findings with historical information. This continuity is especially important in cold cases. Investigators reviewing decades-old files must distinguish between information that has been conclusively resolved and issues that remain open. Accurate documentation permits this process while minimizing unnecessary duplication of earlier investigative work. The public identification of the suspect also contributed to ongoing discussions within the forensic community regarding investigative genetic genealogy. As more cold cases have been resolved through this method, law enforcement agencies have developed increasingly standardized procedures governing its use. These procedures generally emphasize scientific validation, confirmatory DNA testing, legal oversight, and transparency regarding investigative methodology. Karen Stitt's case is frequently referenced as one example among many demonstrating how these practices can contribute to resolving historical homicides. At the same time, investigators continue to recognize that not every cold case will benefit from genetic genealogy. Successful application depends upon several conditions. Recoverable biological evidence must exist. A reliable DNA profile must be generated. Appropriate genealogical matches must be available. Traditional investigative work must support and confirm the genealogical findings. Absent these factors, other investigative approaches may remain necessary. For this reason, cold case units continue to employ a wide range of investigative techniques rather than relying exclusively on any single scientific method. The Karen Stitt investigation ultimately illustrates the complementary relationship between science and detective work. Scientific advances created new investigative opportunities, but those opportunities required careful interpretation, historical research, and conventional investigative verification before conclusions could be reached. Neither science nor traditional policing alone would likely have resolved the case. Together, however, they provided investigators with sufficient evidence to identify the individual they concluded was responsible for Karen Stitt's murder. Nearly half a century after the crime, the investigation achieved an outcome that had once appeared unlikely. Although criminal prosecution was no longer possible because the identified suspect had died before the public announcement, investigators were able to answer the central question that had remained unresolved since 1972. For the broader criminal justice community, the case serves as an example of the continuing evolution of forensic investigation. It demonstrates that unresolved homicides may still yield answers. When evidence has been preserved, scientific capabilities continue to advance, and investigators remain committed to reviewing historical cases with both persistence and objectivity. The investigation into Karen Stitt's death represents a broader story about how unsolved cases evolve over time. A homicide that begins as an immediate search for answers can eventually become a long-term effort involving multiple generations of investigators, changing technologies, and new methods of examining evidence. In 1972, investigators faced the same fundamental challenge that exists in every homicide investigation: establishing what happened, identifying who was responsible, and building enough evidence to support that conclusion. The difference was that the tools available at the time were limited compared with those used decades later. The original investigation relied on traditional methods. Detectives collected physical evidence, documented the crime scene, interviewed individuals connected to Karen, and attempted to reconstruct the events leading to her death. These procedures formed the foundation of the case, even though the technology needed for definitive identification did not yet exist. The passage of time created additional difficulties. Memories change. Witnesses move away. Records become harder to locate. People connected to an investigation may no longer be available to provide information. For many cold cases, these challenges become impossible barriers. However, some investigations remain viable because critical evidence survives. Karen Stitt's case continued because investigators had preserved biological evidence that could later be examined using more advanced scientific methods. This aspect of the investigation highlights a central reality of forensic science. Evidence can become more valuable as technology improves. When the evidence was first collected in 1972, investigators could not have known exactly how future laboratories would analyze it. They could only preserve it carefully and maintain the possibility that future methods might reveal information unavailable at the time. Decades later, that possibility became reality. The development of modern DNA analysis allowed scientists to extract genetic information from biological material associated with the crime. This information created a new investigative pathway, but it did not immediately produce an answer. A DNA profile without a known comparison remains an incomplete solution. Investigators still needed a way to connect the genetic information to an individual. This challenge reflects one of the greatest difficulties in cold case investigations. Finding evidence is only the first step. The evidence must then be interpreted, compared, and placed within a larger investigative framework. Investigative genetic genealogy provided that additional framework. The method introduced a new way of approaching unidentified DNA profiles. Instead of searching only for the offender's own genetic information within criminal databases, investigators could examine relationships between the unknown DNA profile and individuals who had voluntarily participated in genealogy databases. The resulting information created possibilities that traditional database searches could not provide. However, the process required extensive analysis. A genetic connection does not automatically reveal a suspect. Investigators must carefully construct family relationships, evaluate historical records, and eliminate individuals who do not match the known facts of the case. The work is detailed and methodical. Genealogists may examine generations of family records to identify patterns and connections. They compare locations, ages, family histories, and other available information to determine which individuals could realistically be connected to the evidence. Detectives then apply traditional investigative reasoning. Could the person have been present in the area? Did their age correspond with the circumstances of the crime? Did available information support or contradict their possible involvement? These questions remain essential because forensic technology provides information, but human investigators must determine its meaning. In Karen Stitt's case, this combination of genetic genealogy and conventional detective work allowed investigators to develop a suspect identification that could later be supported through direct DNA comparison. The confirmation process was critical. Scientific identification requires accuracy. Investigators must ensure that conclusions are supported by evidence and that alternative explanations have been considered. The role of confirmation is especially important in historical cases, where public attention can create pressure for quick answers. Law enforcement agencies must balance the desire for resolution with the responsibility to ensure that investigative conclusions are based on reliable evidence. The announcement regarding Karen Stitt's case demonstrated that commitment. Rather than relying solely on a genealogical connection, investigators pursued additional forensic confirmation before publicly identifying the individual they believed responsible. The outcome also reflected an important reality of cold case investigations. Justice can take many forms. In cases where a suspect is identified but cannot face trial, the resolution process differs from a traditional criminal prosecution. There is no courtroom presentation of evidence, no jury decision, and no sentence. Instead, the investigative record becomes the primary means through which authorities explain their conclusions. For families of homicide victims, this distinction is significant. A legal resolution and an investigative resolution are not the same. A courtroom can provide a public examination of evidence and a formal judgment. An investigative conclusion can provide answers about what occurred and who authorities believe was responsible. Both forms of resolution carry meaning, but they are achieved through different processes. The Karen Stitt investigation also contributed to broader awareness of the possibilities created by modern forensic methods. It became another example of how cases from previous decades can be revisited when scientific capabilities advance. For law enforcement agencies, the lesson is clear. An unsolved case should not necessarily be considered permanently unsolvable. As technology changes, old evidence may acquire new significance. A sample stored for decades may become a critical investigative resource. A record overlooked in an earlier investigation may become important when combined with new information. A case file that once appeared complete may contain unanswered questions waiting for future investigators to examine. The resolution of Karen Stitt's case therefore represents more than the conclusion of one investigation. It reflects a continuing transformation in how society approaches unsolved crimes. The combination of scientific progress, careful evidence preservation, and investigative persistence has changed expectations surrounding cold cases. Time remains a major obstacle, but it is no longer always an absolute barrier. Nearly 50 years separated the crime from the identification of the person investigators concluded was responsible. That period represents decades of unanswered questions, evolving technology, and continued investigative effort. The case stands as an example of how modern forensic science can reopen doors that once appeared permanently closed, allowing investigators to revisit the past with tools that earlier generations could never have imagined. The significance of the Karen Stitt investigation extends beyond the identification of one individual. It represents a turning point in the way investigators approach historical crimes and demonstrates how the relationship between technology and traditional police work continues to evolve. For decades, cold cases were often limited by the evidence available at the time of the original investigation. If investigators could not identify a suspect through witnesses, physical evidence, or existing records, many cases eventually reached a point where no further progress appeared possible. The emergence of advanced forensic methods changed that reality. However, technology alone does not solve cases. The successful resolution of older investigations depends on decisions made years or even decades earlier. Evidence must have been properly collected, documented, and preserved. Investigative records must remain accessible. Future investigators must be willing to examine old files with new perspectives. The Karen Stitt case demonstrates how these elements can come together. When the homicide occurred in 1972, investigators worked under the scientific limitations of that era. DNA profiling, which would later become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigations, was still years away from development. The concept of using genetic relationships to identify an unknown offender had not yet entered forensic practice. The investigators of that period could only work with the resources available to them. They gathered evidence. They interviewed potential witnesses. They documented the circumstances surrounding Karen's death. They attempted to identify patterns and connections that might lead to the person responsible. Although the case remained unresolved, the work completed during those early stages preserved the foundation for future investigators. Decades later, when forensic technology advanced, those preserved materials became the starting point for a new investigation. This process reflects an important reality of cold case work. Solving a historical crime often requires cooperation between the past and the present. Earlier investigators provide the evidence. Modern investigators provide new analytical methods. Together, they create possibilities that neither generation could achieve alone. The use of investigative genetic genealogy also introduced a new dimension to criminal investigations. Traditional forensic DNA analysis typically focuses on direct identification. A sample recovered from a crime scene is compared with known DNA profiles to determine whether there is a match. Genetic genealogy expands that approach by examining biological relationships. A DNA profile may reveal connections to distant relatives rather than the individual who left the evidence. Those relationships can provide investigators with a pathway toward identifying possible family lines connected to the unknown person. But this process requires caution. A family connection does not establish guilt. A genealogical relationship does not prove criminal involvement. Investigators must combine genetic information with additional evidence, including historical records and forensic confirmation. This careful approach is essential because the consequences of an incorrect identification can be severe. The Karen Stitt investigation followed this broader principle. The genealogical research created an investigative lead, but authorities relied on additional DNA analysis and investigative review before announcing their conclusions. This distinction is important in understanding how modern cold case investigations operate. Scientific tools can open a door. Detective work determines what lies behind it. The case also raised awareness about the importance of ethical considerations surrounding genetic genealogy. As the method has become more widely used, discussions have continued regarding privacy, consent, database policies, and appropriate law enforcement procedures. These discussions reflect the changing nature of forensic investigation. Technology can provide extraordinary opportunities, but those opportunities must be balanced with careful standards and responsible practices. For investigators, the objective remains unchanged, finding the truth through reliable evidence. The circumstances surrounding Karen Stitt's case also highlight the enduring impact of unresolved crimes on families and communities. While public attention may decrease over time, the absence of answers can remain a permanent source of uncertainty for those affected. A cold case represents more than an unfinished investigation file. It represents a person whose life ended, a family changed forever, and a community that continued carrying unanswered questions. When investigators eventually identify a person responsible, the result cannot restore what was lost. However, it can provide information that was unavailable for decades and bring clarity to a case that had remained unresolved. The resolution of Karen Stitt's case demonstrates why law enforcement agencies continue investing in cold case reviews. Every preserved piece of evidence represents the possibility that future science may reveal information that current science cannot. The passage of time changes many things, but it does not always eliminate the possibility of discovery. Investigators today approach historical cases with a different understanding of what evidence can become. A small biological sample, a forgotten document, or an overlooked connection may eventually become the key element in solving a decades-old investigation. The Karen Stitt case stands as one example of that transformation. It shows how advances in forensic science have expanded the boundaries of criminal investigation and how persistence can connect events separated by generations. Nearly 50 years after the crime, investigators were able to identify the individual they concluded was responsible, demonstrating that even the oldest cases may still contain answers waiting to be uncovered through new methods, careful analysis, and continued commitment to finding the truth. The conclusion of the Karen Stitt investigation did not arrive through a single dramatic moment. There was no unexpected confession, no final witness suddenly stepping forward after decades of silence, and no forgotten document discovered in an old archive. Instead, the answer emerged through a process that represented the changing nature of modern criminal investigations, a combination of preserved evidence, scientific advancement, and years of careful investigative work. For the detectives who inherited the case decades after the original investigation began, the challenge was not simply finding new information. It was understanding how old information could be viewed differently through the lens of modern science. Cold case investigators often describe their work as looking backward while thinking forward. They must respect the work of the original investigators while recognizing that new technology may reveal possibilities that were previously impossible. A report written decades earlier, a piece of evidence stored for years, or a detail that once appeared insignificant can gain new importance when examined with updated methods. Karen Stitt's case followed this pattern. The original investigation created a foundation of information. Investigators in 1972 documented the crime scene, collected available evidence, and attempted to reconstruct the circumstances surrounding Karen's death. Although those efforts did not immediately lead to an identification, they preserved critical elements that later investigators could revisit. The advancement of DNA technology transformed that possibility. In modern investigations, DNA is often viewed as one of the strongest forms of forensic evidence because it can establish biological connections with a high degree of reliability. However, the presence of DNA does not automatically answer every question. Investigators must still determine whose DNA it is, how it relates to the crime, and whether other evidence supports the conclusion. This is where the investigation became a combination of science and traditional detective work. The genetic profile recovered from evidence connected to Karen's murder provided a starting point. Investigators then used genealogical research to explore possible biological connections. Instead of searching for a direct criminal database match, they examined relationships that extended through family lines. The process required patience. Genealogical investigations are complex because human family histories contain countless branches. A distant DNA connection may involve relatives separated by several generations. Researchers must carefully map relationships, verify records, and determine which individuals fit the known circumstances of the case. Every document matters. A birth record can establish a timeline. A marriage record can connect family branches. A historical address can place an individual in a specific location. An obituary can confirm relationships between generations. Together, these records create a detailed map that investigators can analyze. The objective is not to assume guilt based on a family connection. The objective is to identify possible investigative paths that can later be tested through independent evidence. This distinction is one of the most important aspects of forensic genealogy. It is a tool for generating leads, not replacing investigation. In Karen Stitt's case, the genealogical findings eventually directed investigators toward an individual whose background matched the circumstances surrounding the crime. Additional forensic work was then used to support the identification. The result represented a major development in a case that had remained unresolved since 1972. However, the passage of time created a reality that many cold case investigations eventually face. The person identified by investigators was no longer available to face criminal proceedings. This meant the case would not follow the traditional path of arrest, trial, and sentencing. There would be no courtroom where evidence was presented before a jury. No cross-examination of witnesses. No final verdict delivered by a judge. Instead, the resolution came through the investigative conclusion reached after decades of examination. For Karen's family, the significance of that conclusion was deeply personal. Families of homicide victims often carry questions that remain unanswered for years. They may wonder whether investigators will ever discover the truth, whether the person responsible is still alive, and whether the circumstances surrounding their loved one's death will ever become known. A cold case creates a unique form of uncertainty. Time passes, but the questions remain. The identification in Karen Stitt's case provided information that had been missing for almost half a century. It demonstrated that even when traditional investigative methods reach their limits, future advances may create new opportunities. The case also became part of a larger national conversation about unresolved crimes and the role of emerging forensic technologies. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies began reviewing older homicide investigations using similar approaches. Cases that had remained inactive for decades were reconsidered. Evidence stored long ago was examined again. Investigators searched for opportunities created by scientific progress. Not every investigation would achieve the same result. Some cases lack biological evidence. Some evidence cannot produce a usable DNA profile. Some investigations remain limited by missing records or insufficient information. But every successful cold case resolution reinforces the same principle. Unanswered does not always mean unsolvable. The Karen Stitt investigation became an example of that possibility. A case that began in an era before DNA identification eventually reached a conclusion because evidence survived long enough for science to catch up. The story of the investigation is therefore not only about a crime committed in 1972. It is also about the decades that followed, decades in which technology changed, investigative methods evolved, and the meaning of evidence itself was transformed. Nearly 50 years separated the original investigation from the identification of the person authorities concluded was responsible. That span of time represents an extraordinary challenge for any investigation. But it also demonstrates something equally important. The passage of time does not erase the value of truth. For detectives working cold cases, every preserved piece of evidence represents a possibility. Every unanswered question represents a reason to continue looking, and every scientific advancement creates another opportunity to revisit the past. The Karen Stitt case remains a reminder that investigations do not always end when the first search fails. Sometimes the answers are waiting for the moment when the right technology, the right expertise, and the determination to continue searching finally come together. The investigation into Karen Stitt's murder represents one of the clearest examples of how criminal investigations can change across generations. A case that began with the investigative tools of the early 1970s eventually reached a resolution through technologies that could not have been imagined when detectives first began searching for answers. The transformation was not immediate. For decades, the investigation existed within the limitations of its time. Detectives could only work with the evidence available to them, the witnesses they could locate, and the forensic methods accessible through contemporary science. Every unsolved case carries unanswered questions, but cold cases create a unique challenge because the passage of time affects nearly every aspect of an investigation. People move. Memories become less precise. Physical locations change. Records become more difficult to locate. Investigators who originally handled the case may retire or pass away. Despite these challenges, the Karen Stitt investigation remained possible because important evidence survived. That evidence became the bridge between the past and the present. When modern forensic scientists examined biological material connected to the homicide, they were able to generate information that earlier investigators could never have obtained. This development changed the direction of the investigation and created a new opportunity to identify the person responsible. The use of genetic genealogy demonstrated how criminal investigations have expanded beyond traditional methods. Historically, detectives searching for an unknown suspect relied heavily on direct evidence. They looked for eyewitnesses, fingerprints, physical descriptions, known associates, or suspects already connected to criminal databases. Genetic genealogy introduced another method. It allowed investigators to explore biological relationships and reconstruct possible family connections. This approach provided a new pathway in cases where the offender's DNA existed but no direct match was available. However, the process required extensive verification. Investigators could not simply identify a person through a distant genetic connection and declare the case solved. Every possibility had to be examined carefully. Researchers needed to confirm family relationships, compare historical information, and determine whether a potential suspect fit the known facts. This careful process reflects a broader principle in forensic investigations. Technology provides information, but evidence must be interpreted within context. The Karen Stitt case demonstrates how modern investigations combine scientific capability with traditional detective methods. DNA analysis created the opportunity. Genealogical research expanded the search. Investigative review provided context. Confirmation testing supported the conclusion. Each step contributed to the final determination. The case also highlights the importance of collaboration. Modern homicide investigations often involve professionals from different fields working together toward a common goal. Forensic laboratories provide scientific expertise. Detectives provide investigative judgment. Genealogists provide historical and family research. Legal professionals ensure procedures meet required standards. The resolution of a decades-old case is rarely the result of one individual discovery. It is usually the result of many people contributing knowledge and effort over a long period of time. For the law enforcement community, Karen Stitt's case became another example of why maintaining cold case files remains important. A case that appears inactive may still contain valuable evidence capable of producing answers years later. The investigation also reinforced the importance of preserving biological evidence whenever possible. In the past, investigators could not always predict the future value of collected materials. Today, evidence preservation is viewed as a critical investment in future investigative possibilities. Scientific progress continues to expand what can be achieved. Techniques that once required large biological samples can now work with much smaller amounts of material. Laboratory methods continue to improve accuracy and reliability. Databases and investigative resources continue to evolve. Each advancement creates new opportunities for unresolved cases. At the same time, the use of emerging forensic technologies has encouraged discussions about responsible practices. Genetic information is deeply personal, and law enforcement agencies must balance investigative benefits with privacy considerations and appropriate legal safeguards. These discussions are part of the continuing evolution of forensic science. The goal remains consistent, using reliable evidence to establish the truth while maintaining public confidence in investigative procedures. The Karen Stitt investigation demonstrates both the possibilities and the responsibilities associated with modern forensic methods. The eventual identification of the person investigators concluded was responsible provided an answer that had remained unavailable for nearly 50 years. Yet the case also serves as a reminder that every homicide investigation involves more than evidence and technology. At the center of every case is a person whose life was lost and a family that endured decades of uncertainty. For those families, answers matter. Knowing what happened does not erase the loss, but it can provide information that allows them to understand a chapter of their lives that had remained unresolved. The investigation into Karen Stitt's death moved from uncertainty to resolution through a combination of persistence, preservation, and scientific advancement. It began with detectives working in 1972 using the tools of their era. It continued through decades of unanswered questions. It eventually reached a conclusion through methods created by generations that followed. That timeline illustrates a fundamental truth about cold case investigations. They are not simply stories of the past. They are ongoing efforts shaped by the future. Evidence preserved decades earlier may become significant years later. Scientific breakthroughs may reveal information hidden for generations. Investigators may find answers long after the original search appeared to have ended. The Karen Stitt case stands as a reminder that time can delay justice, but it does not always prevent discovery. Through continued investigation and advances in science, a case that remained unresolved for nearly half a century ultimately reached a point of identification and explanation. Nearly 50 years separated the murder of Karen Stitt from the moment investigators were able to identify the person they concluded was responsible. That passage of time represents an extraordinary period in the history of a criminal investigation. It spans generations of detectives, dramatic changes in forensic science, and a transformation in how society understands the possibility of solving old cases. When Karen Stitt was killed in 1972, investigators had no way of knowing that evidence collected during the original investigation would eventually become the foundation for a breakthrough decades later. They could not predict the arrival of DNA profiling. They could not predict the development of investigative genetic genealogy. They could not predict that information contained within biological evidence would one day connect an unknown offender to a family history extending across generations. But they preserved the evidence, and that decision allowed future investigators to continue searching. The final resolution of the case was not the result of one discovery made overnight. It was the result of a long chain of investigative efforts, with each generation contributing another piece to the process. The detectives who first investigated Karen's death established the foundation. The scientists who later analyzed the evidence created new possibilities. The genealogists who examined biological relationships developed investigative pathways. The investigators who reviewed the findings confirmed the information through additional forensic work. Together, these efforts transformed a case that had remained unresolved for decades. The story of Karen Stitt's investigation reflects a broader change in criminal justice. In previous generations, many cold cases were considered nearly impossible to solve once traditional investigative leads were exhausted. Today, that assumption has changed. Advances in forensic science have demonstrated that old cases can still contain valuable evidence. A biological sample stored for decades may still provide information. A document overlooked years earlier may become significant when combined with new findings. A connection between individuals separated by generations may reveal a path that investigators could not previously follow. Modern cold case investigations are built on this possibility. However, the resolution of an old case requires more than technology. It requires patience, accuracy, and a commitment to following evidence wherever it leads. The Karen Stitt investigation demonstrates why this combination matters. Genetic genealogy created a new investigative direction, but the process still required careful analysis. Investigators had to distinguish between possibilities and facts. They had to examine information objectively and ensure that conclusions were supported by reliable evidence. This approach is essential because every identification carries enormous responsibility. A criminal investigation is not simply about finding a name. It is about establishing the truth through evidence. The investigators involved in Karen Stitt's case followed that principle by using genetic information as a starting point and then seeking additional confirmation before reaching their final conclusion. The result brought an answer to a question that had remained open since 1972. For Karen's family, the identification represented a moment that previous generations had waited decades to see. While no investigation can restore the life that was lost, understanding what happened can provide a sense of clarity after years of uncertainty. Cold cases often create a unique form of emotional hardship because families live with unanswered questions. They may never know whether the person responsible was identified. They may wonder if the truth will ever become known. They may continue searching for information long after public attention has disappeared. The resolution of Karen Stitt's case demonstrates why cold case investigations remain important. The pursuit of answers continues even when years have passed and circumstances have changed. The case also reflects the evolving relationship between technology and justice. Scientific progress does not replace human investigation. Instead, it expands what investigators can accomplish. A laboratory result requires interpretation. A genetic connection requires research. A potential suspect requires confirmation. Every breakthrough depends on the cooperation of different areas of expertise. This collaborative approach has changed the future of criminal investigations. Agencies now recognize that unresolved cases may deserve renewed attention when new tools become available. The lesson from cases like Karen Stitt's is clear. Time does not erase evidence. It does not erase the importance of finding answers. And it does not necessarily prevent investigators from returning to questions that have remained unanswered for decades. The investigation that began in 1972 eventually reached a conclusion through a combination of preserved evidence, scientific innovation, and continued dedication. A case that once seemed destined to remain unresolved became an example of how modern forensic methods can transform the investigation of historical crimes. The name of the technology may change. The methods may continue to evolve. But the fundamental purpose of homicide investigation remains the same: seeking the truth, identifying those responsible, and providing answers to those who have waited for them. The murder of Karen Stitt remained unsolved for nearly half a century. Yet the investigation endured because evidence was preserved and because investigators continued to believe that unanswered questions could still be resolved. In the end, the case became a reminder that some investigations are not defined by how long they remain open, but by the determination to continue searching. Nearly 50 years after Karen Stitt's death, the mystery surrounding her case was no longer unanswered. Through the combined efforts of multiple generations of investigators and the advancement of forensic science, authorities were able to identify the individual they concluded was responsible. The investigation closed a chapter that had remained open since 1972. But its legacy continues. It stands as an example of the possibilities created when science, persistence, and the pursuit of truth come together, proving that even after decades have passed, some answers are still waiting to be found. The resolution of the Karen Stitt investigation marked the end of one search, but it also represented the beginning of a larger conversation about how society remembers victims of unsolved crimes and how law enforcement continues pursuing answers long after a case disappears from public attention. For decades, Karen Stitt's name remained connected to an investigation that had no conclusion. The case existed in records, evidence rooms, and the memories of those who continued waiting for answers. While time changed the world around the investigation, the fundamental questions remained the same. What happened? Who was responsible? Could the truth ever be discovered? Those questions are at the center of every cold case investigation. Unlike active investigations, where detectives immediately respond to new information and fresh evidence, cold cases require a different approach. They require investigators to examine history itself. Every report, every photograph, every laboratory document, and every recorded statement becomes part of a timeline that must be carefully reconstructed. The passage of time creates obstacles, but it can also create opportunities. Technology advances. Records become digitized. New investigative techniques emerge. A piece of evidence that once seemed limited may become valuable through scientific innovation. The Karen Stitt investigation demonstrates this unusual relationship between time and evidence. The decades that passed after the crime created enormous challenges, but those same decades also allowed forensic science to develop tools capable of revealing information that was previously hidden. The use of genetic genealogy represents one of the most significant changes in modern cold case investigations. Before this technology became available, many unidentified DNA profiles reached a dead end. Investigators could confirm that biological evidence belonged to an unknown individual, but without a direct match in law enforcement databases, there was often nowhere else to search. Genetic genealogy changed that process. It allowed investigators to look beyond traditional criminal databases and examine biological relationships across generations. Instead of asking only, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators could also ask, "Who are this person's relatives?" That question created an entirely new investigative pathway. Family trees became investigative maps. Historical records became evidence. Generational connections became potential leads. However, the process required careful interpretation. Human family networks are complicated. Distant relatives can share genetic information without having any connection to a crime. Investigators must separate meaningful relationships from unrelated connections and avoid reaching conclusions before evidence supports them. This balance between technology and caution is one of the defining characteristics of modern forensic work. Scientific tools can reveal possibilities. Investigators must determine whether those possibilities represent reality. The Karen Stitt case also highlights the importance of collaboration between different fields. Modern criminal investigations increasingly depend on specialists who bring different forms of expertise. A detective may understand the circumstances of a crime. A forensic scientist may understand the biological evidence. A genealogist may understand historical family connections. A legal expert may evaluate investigative procedures. Together, these perspectives create a more complete picture than any single approach could provide. The investigation also serves as a reminder that behind every forensic breakthrough is a human story. Cold cases are not only about evidence, technology, and investigative methods. They are about individuals whose lives were changed forever. Karen Stitt was 15 years old when her life ended. For her family, the passage of nearly 5 decades did not erase the impact of that loss. The years brought changes, but the unanswered questions remained. A resolution cannot restore the future that was taken away. It cannot replace memories. It cannot undo decades of grief. But an answer can provide something that uncertainty cannot: understanding. For many families of homicide victims, knowing what happened becomes an important part of moving forward. The truth does not remove pain, but it removes one of the most difficult burdens: not knowing. The resolution of Karen Stitt's case also demonstrates the importance of continuing to examine unsolved investigations. A case that appears inactive may still contain valuable information. Evidence that has remained untouched for years may become significant when new technology emerges. This has changed how law enforcement agencies view cold cases. They are no longer simply old files stored away and forgotten. They are investigations waiting for the right combination of evidence, technology, and expertise. Across the United States, agencies have established specialized cold case units and partnerships designed to review older crimes. These efforts recognize that justice does not have an expiration date. The circumstances surrounding a crime may become more difficult to investigate as time passes, but the responsibility to seek answers remains. The Karen Stitt investigation became one example of this evolving approach. A case that began before the existence of DNA profiling eventually reached a conclusion through a technology-driven investigation. It connected the methods of the past with the possibilities of the present. The significance of the case extends beyond one investigation. It represents a shift in expectations. For many years, families affected by unsolved crimes were often told that answers might never come. Today, advances in science have created new possibilities. Although not every case can be solved, the number of investigative options has expanded dramatically. The future of cold case investigations will likely continue following this pattern. New technologies will emerge. Existing evidence will be re-examined. Investigators will discover new ways to interpret information collected decades earlier. The boundary between solved and unsolved cases will continue to change. The story of Karen Stitt's investigation is therefore not only a story about the past, it is also a story about the future of criminal investigation. It shows that evidence can survive beyond the era in which it was collected. It shows that scientific progress can change the meaning of old information. And it shows that persistence remains one of the most important elements in solving crimes that have remained unanswered for generations. Nearly 50 years after the investigation began, the question that had remained unresolved since 1972 finally received an answer through the combined efforts of investigators, scientists, and specialists who continued searching. The case became a reminder that every piece of evidence has a story, and sometimes that story cannot be fully understood until decades later. Time may slow an investigation. It may create obstacles. It may change everything around the case. But as the Karen Stitt investigation demonstrated, time alone does not erase the possibility of discovery. The story of the Karen Stitt investigation is ultimately a story about time, evidence, and the changing nature of justice. A homicide that remained unresolved through decades of technological limitations eventually became an example of how modern forensic methods can transform investigations once considered unlikely to reach a conclusion. But behind every scientific development and every investigative breakthrough remains the original purpose of the case: understanding what happened and preserving the memory of the person whose life was taken. When Karen Stitt was killed in 1972, investigators faced the difficult reality of working without the tools that are now considered standard in criminal investigations. The concept of using genetic information to identify an unknown offender was still decades away. Detectives relied on interviews, physical evidence, investigative experience, and careful documentation. Those early efforts created the foundation for everything that followed. Cold cases are often described as investigations that have gone silent, but silence does not mean inactivity. Many remain open for years because investigators recognize that future developments may provide new opportunities. A case file may contain unanswered questions, but it may also contain evidence waiting for a different method of examination. The investigation into Karen Stitt's death followed that pattern. The biological evidence preserved from the original investigation eventually became the focus of renewed analysis. As forensic laboratories developed more advanced techniques, investigators were able to extract information that previous generations could not access. This represented a major shift in criminal investigations. For much of modern history, Investigators were limited by the evidence immediately available. If a suspect could not be identified through witnesses or existing records, progress often stopped. Today, investigators have additional tools. DNA analysis can establish biological connections. Digital databases can organize information across jurisdictions. Genealogical research can reveal relationships separated by generations. Together, these methods have expanded the possibilities for solving historical crimes. However, the successful use of these tools requires discipline. A scientific result must be interpreted carefully. A possible connection must be investigated. A theory must be tested against facts. This process is essential because the purpose of forensic science is not simply to identify possibilities. It is to establish reliable conclusions based on evidence. The Karen Stitt investigation demonstrates this balance between innovation and traditional investigative principles. New technology provided an opportunity, but detectives still needed to examine the information, verify findings, and build a complete understanding of the case. This combination has become a defining feature of modern cold case investigations. Technology opens new doors. Investigators determine where those doors lead. The case also reflects how the role of law enforcement has changed over time. Earlier generations of detectives often worked with limited resources and fewer scientific options. Modern investigators inherit those cases with access to tools that their predecessors could never have imagined. Yet the responsibility remains the same. Every victim deserves a thorough investigation. Every family deserves an effort to find answers. Every piece of evidence deserves careful consideration. The passage of decades can make these goals more difficult, but it does not make them less important. The resolution of Karen Stitt's case also highlights the emotional dimension of cold case work. Investigators often describe these cases as more than professional responsibilities. They involve real people whose lives were permanently affected by violence and uncertainty. For families, the unanswered questions surrounding a homicide can become part of everyday life. Important moments may be accompanied by reminders of what was lost and what remains unknown. When investigators eventually provide answers, those answers carry significance beyond the investigative file. They provide context. They provide understanding. They provide a conclusion to a chapter that remained unfinished for many years. The case also became part of a larger discussion about the future of forensic genealogy and its role in criminal investigations. As more agencies explore this method, questions surrounding accuracy, privacy, and responsible use continue to shape how the technology develops. The scientific community and law enforcement agencies continue working towards standards that ensure these methods are applied carefully and transparently. The objective remains clear: using new capabilities while maintaining public trust. The investigation into Karen Stitt's murder demonstrates how criminal investigations are constantly evolving. Methods that were impossible decades ago can become essential tools in the present. Evidence collected during one era may become the key to solving a case in another. This connection between past and present is one of the most remarkable aspects of forensic science. A detective in 1972 could not know how a future laboratory would analyze evidence. A scientist decades later could not change what happened in the past. But together, their work created a path toward resolution. The case serves as a reminder that investigations are rarely limited to one moment in time. They are ongoing processes shaped by discoveries, technology, and the determination of those who continue searching. Nearly half a century passed before authorities identified the person they concluded was responsible for Karen Stitt's death. That length of time demonstrates both the difficulty of cold case investigations and the potential for perseverance to produce answers. The resolution did not come from a single event. It came from decades of preparation, preservation, scientific advancement, and investigative commitment. The Karen Stitt case remains an example of how the boundaries of criminal investigation continue to expand. What once appeared impossible may become achievable when new knowledge is combined with evidence that has survived the passage of time. In the world of cold cases, every unanswered question represents uncertainty. But every preserved piece of evidence represents possibility. And sometimes, after many years have passed, those possibilities become the answers investigators and families have been searching for.